The reader will notice that the job of the forest ranger is that of an individual who is both dedicated to their country and their duty, and such a ranger was Morales, despite being born in another land. He could spend the entire day on horseback and combat wildfires throughout the night. Although not formally educated in forestry, he possessed an innate curiosity and had a comprehensive grasp of the department's principles. As a practical ranger, he stood halfway between the cowboy, who was initially the only available material, and the trained expert who is being educated to succeed him. He was loyal with the loyalty of a soldier, and his hero was the colonel of the Rough Riders under whom he had campaigned. His second admiration was the chief forester of the department. Most of us are becoming so sensitive, so reliant on central heating and rain boots, that the actions of a man like this riding forth on his trail at all hours of the day and night, self-sufficient and calm, seem like the deeds of an epic, and indeed they are. On the physical side, the plainsman, the cowboy, the poacher are all admirable, but Morales went far beyond their physical toughness. He daydreamed as he rode about his responsibilities. The care of the poor Basque shepherd he had accepted as a matter of routine without Sullivan's revelation of himself, which complicated an exceedingly pitiful case. He could not forget that it was Lisa May's father who stood in danger of contracting the deadly disease, and as he imagined him dying far up there on that barren slope, his heart pained with the tragedy of the old man's life. In this way, the days of the ranger were smoldering toward this end. On the return trail, he turned aside to extinguish a smoldering log next to an abandoned campfire, and again he took a detour into a beautiful little park to visit a fisherman and warn him about the fire hazard. He was the forest guardian, attentive to every sign, and yet all the while he was being drawn toward his temptation. Why not resign and go to the east, taking the girl with him? After all, the life up here is a lonely and challenging one, in no way a calling for an ambitious man. Suppose I am promoted to forest supervisor. That only means a slightly higher salary and life in a small town instead of here. Being a district supervisor would be better, but can I hope to secure such a position? Until this month he had taken his promotion lightly. It was something that would naturally come along. There's no rush. I can wait. Now, however, haste seemed necessary. I'm not as young as I used to be, he admitted. Once back at his cabin, he put aside his intangible problems and began cooking some food to take back with him to the peak. He brought his pack horse and loaded him with camping gear, utensils, and extra clothes. He filled his pockets with the medicines he had, and as night was falling, he finally set off on his difficult trail. The sky was as black as the roof of a cave, as the stars were hidden by a layer of cloud just above his head. The ranger had to feel his way through the first part of his journey. The world became lighter after he left the canyon and entered the dead trees of the glacial valley. But even in the open, the going was tiring, and the horses proceeded with cautiousness. The Basque is a poor, worthless little peasant, but he's a human being, and it would be monstrous to leave him to die up there, he insisted, as the horses stumbled upward over the rocks of a vast lateral moraine towards the summit, blinded by the clouds they had to pass through. He was now dismounted and picking his way with a small flashlight, whose weak beam, like that of a firefly, illuminated a small area of the dripping rocks. Everything else was a tangible yellow mist that had a sulfuric smell and clung to everything it touched. The wind had completely died down, and the mountainside was as quiet as the moon. Foot by foot he struggled up the slope, hoping every moment to break through this layer of mist into the clear air. He knew from many previous experiences that the open sky existed just a little way above, that this was only a roof. Finally, he parted the mist and burst into the moonlit heights above. He took a deep breath, filled with awe, as he turned and looked around. Above him the sky was filled with countless sparkling stars, and the crescent moon shone like polished silver. On the same level as his chest, there stretched out a boundless, silent, and mystical ocean of clouds that crashed against the dark peaks without making a sound, and spread out towards the east, shimmering wider and wider. All the smaller hills were covered. Only the rulers of the mountain range towered above the flood in a solemn and unmoving majesty. Morales stood next to his tired horses for a long time, letting the beauty of this world fill his soul. a world that was so familiar yet so transformed. He longed for his beloved. She would feel, understand, and rejoice with him. It was experiences like these that made him satisfied with his work. Nature, for the ranger, sometimes staged her most profound dramas with the rush of the wind and the crash of thunder, and sometimes like this, in a silence so deep that the act of breathing felt like a harsh and discordant note. Slowly the mystical waters receded, sinking with a gentle rolling motion into the valleys, and sudden dark forms emerged from the white waves like strange masters of the deep. Towers took shape and islands rose up, crowned with dark fortresses. To the west, a vast and pitch-black Gibraltar appeared as if by magic. Soon the sea became a massive river flowing within the towering walls of an ancient glacier, a mere echo of the icy stream that once carved its slow path between these iron cliffs. With a shiver of awe, the ranger turned away from the overwhelming beauty of this combination of night, clouds, and mountain peaks, and continued his ascent. Such scenes, with their grandeur, their fleeting nature, their enormous and careless speed, caused him an indescribable sense of sadness. Over and over again he turned around, yearning for some ability that would allow him to capture and recreate even a fraction of this incredible and silent spectacle for his beloved to see. He no longer found satisfaction in experiencing the wonders of nature alone. On the chilly and quiet side of the Great Divide, the faint glow of the shepherd's tent could be seen, and with a renewed sense of duty towards his fellow beings on the continent's summit, Morales pressed forward. Sullivan greeted him at the entrance, no longer the destitute old wanderer, but a priest who had dedicated himself to serving Christ. "How is he?" the ranger inquired. "Delirious," the shepherd replied. "I've had to restrain him in his bed. I'm relieved you've arrived. It's lonely up here. Don't come too close. Set up your tent over there by the trees. I can't have you infected. Stay away from me in this camp. I've brought some food and extra clothing for you. Place them down here, and in the morning drive these sheep away. Their noise disturbs the foreigner, and I don't care for it myself. It sounds desolate and helpless. That dog took them away for a while, but brought them back again. Poor thing, it doesn't know what to make of all this." Archer followed Sullivan's instructions, moving a bit further down the slope. Without setting up his tent, he wrapped himself in his blankets and fell asleep. The sun rose magnificently. The wind blew gently from the east, as the mountains often do, and the air carried the unmistakable scent of late March. The short and delicate grass, the small flowers tucked away in sheltered corners of the rocks, and the countless bleats of the lambs perfectly matched the season. It was spring in the world, and despite all his perplexities, it was spring in the ranger's heart. The Basque would recover, the brave ex-convict would not be affected, and all would be fine. Such resilience is characteristic of young hearts. His first task was to feed the loyal collie and send him out with the herd. His next duty was to start a fire and prepare breakfast for Sullivan. As he placed it next to the tent entrance, he heard the desperate pleas of the Basque, who was wrestling with his caregiver, likely believing he was being held captive. Only a few words like "go home" and "sheep" were understood by the nurse or the ranger. "Stay calm now, quiet boy. Everything is okay. I'm here to take care of you," Sullivan repeated endlessly. Morales waited for a moment of silence, then softly called, "Here's your breakfast, Sullivan." "Step away," the man inside retorted. "Keep your distance." Archer walked a little further away, and Sullivan approached the door. "The foreigner is definitely sick, there's no doubt about that. How far is the nearest doctor?" "I could call one from the Kettle Ranch, about 20 miles south of here. If he doesn't improve today, I think we'll need a doctor." He looked so pale and aged that Morales said, "You need rest. Now I believe I've had the chicken pox. I know I've been vaccinated, and if you go to bed..." "If you're saying all that just to offer to come in here, you're wasting your breath. I don't plan on letting you get any closer than you are. There's work for you to do. Plus, there's my daughter. You're assigned to look after her." "Would a doctor be willing to come?" asked Archer, his voice hoarse, moved by Sullivan's words. "It's a difficult climb. Would they consider the foreigner worth it?" Sullivan's face darkened with uncertainty. "It's a tough journey for a city dweller. But maybe he would come for you on behalf of the government. I highly doubt it, even if I were to offer my next month's salary as a fee. These hills are very remote for the townspeople, and one person more or less is of no importance. But I'll see what I can do." Archer was truly more concerned for Sullivan himself than for the Basque. "If the fever is something malignant, we need medical help," he said, and went back to his own camp to contemplate his perplexing problem. One thing could definitely be done, and that was to inform Patrick and Murphy of their herder's illness. Surely they would come to the aid of the collie and his flock. To reach a telephone involved either a ride over to Deer Creek or a return to the Fork. He was tempted to ride all the way to the Fork, as it would allow for another encounter with Lisa. However, it would take many more hours, and a half-day's delay could be fatal for the Basque. Furthermore, each hour of solitude and labor made Sullivan even more vulnerable to the deadly disease. This was the tragic aspect of the wilderness. In such moments, even the Fork seemed like a haven. The mountains provide an excellent camping spot for the young and the strong, but they are unforgiving enemies to the disabled or elderly. They may not give loathsome diseases like pox, but they do not assist in the defense of the sick. Cold and distant, their clouds pass by. The night winds nip. The rains fall relentlessly. There are sheltering rocks, of course, but their comfort is minimal for a person struck with the afflictions of a bustling city. In these heights, man is no more valuable than the wolf or the rabbit. It was difficult to abandon an aged and decrepit man in such a gloomy and wind-battered location, but it was necessary. Therefore, securing his tent firmly behind a cluster of junipers, Morales mounted his horse and rode away across the boundary of the forest into the Deer Creek Basin, which had been a source of much conflict for nearly 4 years. It was a vast, park-like area, thinly wooded, enchanting during the summer but frigid and desolate in the winter. The summers were brief, and frost appeared almost every week, even in July and August. It had once been a section of the forest, but due to pressure, the president had allowed it to be returned to the public lands available for settlement. It wasn't agricultural land, as certain ranchers argued, but it served as excellent summer grazing pasture, prompting the sheep herders and cattle ranchers to engage in fierce battles for ownership. Sheep were mercilessly bludgeoned to death by the hundreds. Herders were forcibly expelled from the park with ropes around their necks and their belongings destroyed, all within a few miles of the forest boundary, where a lone sentinel vigilantly kept watch. Morales had only traversed this trail once before, and he was attempting to locate the cliff from which a flock of sheep had been thrown by cattle ranchers years ago, when he spotted a slender column of smoke rising from a rocky hillside. With his customary vigilance regarding fires, he raised his magnifying glass to his eyes and scrutinized the area. It was evidently a campfire, smoldering perilously, and redirecting his horse, he headed towards it to extinguish the flames. It was not within his designated patrol area, but that was inconsequential. His duty was unmistakable. As he drew nearer, he began to notice signs of an abandoned camp. The ground was strewn with utensils. It was not an ordinary campfire, and the ranger's heart raced. "Another sheep herder has been forced out and his tent and supplies incinerated," he exclaimed, seething with anger. His horse snorted and veered as he rode closer, and then a tremor ran through the ranger's heart as he noticed a boot heel and a charred hand in the remains of the fire. The smoke carried the stench of human flesh. For a long time the ranger sat on his horse, peering into the ashes until it became clear to him that at least 2 sheep herders had been sacrificed due to the cattleman's intense hatred and greed. The story was evident all around on the grass. 2, maybe 3 men had been brutally murdered, dismembered, and burned just hours before. The bloody spade used to dismember the bodies stood there, and an empty container, whose oil had been poured on the camp utensils, tent, and wagon of the herders in an attempt to burn the hacked limbs, lay nearby. The lawlessness of the area had reached its peak. The herders' ferocity had surpassed savagery. In the pleasant autumn air, the stench of the cattleman's revenge rose like a repugnant, poisonous vapor. The ranger felt sick as the gruesome tale unfolded before him. Then a strong hatred for such warfare ignited in his heart. Could this atrocity occur under any other civilized flag? Would any other government intertwine its state and federal authority so foolishly, so childishly, as to allow such evil? This was the inevitable result of the state's essential lawlessness. It was the answer to local self-government and democracy. Something like this could not happen in Australia or Canada. Only in America could vigilante justice become a thrilling pastime, a joke, a tool for personal revenge. Both the South and the West were tainted with the blood of lynching victims, and the entire nation was filled with shame. In his horror and revolt, he cursed the state to which he belonged. He was on the verge of resigning his position at that very moment. Such was his intense anger towards the passive, careless, cheerful, untidy government under which he was serving. "Oh, my God," he whispered with serious intensity. "If this doesn't shame the people of this state into rebellion, if these monsters are not relentlessly pursued and executed, I will personally torment them. I cannot continue to live and fulfill my duty here unless this crime is punished by the law." It didn't matter to him that these herders were poor Basques. It was the complete, horrifying, and destructive disregard for the law that stirred such unrest in his veins. His education in England, his training as a soldier, his inherent refinement, all were offended. Moreover, he loved the West. He had given up his British citizenship for this. Cold, trembling and numb, he spurred his horse and rode furiously down the trail towards the nearest town, so eager to spread the alarm that he could barely take a deep breath. On the steep slopes, he was forced to walk, and his horse performed so poorly that his agony of impatience deepened. He envisioned the murderers riding swiftly into distant lands. Each passing hour made their capture increasingly difficult. Who were they? He asked himself repeatedly. What kind of person would commit such an act? Was the leader a man like Musina? Even if so, he was hired. By whom? By ranchers who coveted the land. That was absolutely certain. It was well past noon when he reached the end of the telephone line in a small store and post office at the upper falls of Deer Creek. Fortunately, there was a telephone booth, and he quickly got in touch with Cooper, although his voice was so strained and unnatural that his superior didn't recognize it. "Is that you, Archer? What's the matter? Your voice sounds raspy." Archer composed himself and briefly recounted his story. "I'm at Kettle Ranch Post Office. Now listen, the cattle rancher's brutality has reached its limit. As I rode down here to get in touch with a doctor for a sick rancher, I stumbled upon the scene of another murder and fire. The fire is still smoldering. At least 2 bodies are in the ashes." Finally, bit by bit, from quick conversation, the supervisor gathered the information, the location, the time, and instructed the rancher to ride back and protect the remains until the sheriff arrived. "Keep it all hush-hush," warned Archer, "and get the sheriff and a doctor to come up here as quickly as possible. What on earth is happening in this country?" he exclaimed in despair. "Will this crime go unpunished, like the others?" Cooper's voice had lost its hopeful tone. "I don't know. I am shocked by it all. Don't do anything reckless, Archer. Wait until I arrive. Maybe this is the turning point out here. I'll be there at the earliest opportunity." The bitter and discouraged ranger then called Lisa May, and the sound of her pleasant voice shifted his thoughts to other, and in a way, more significant matters. Because when she heard his name, she exclaimed with such eager longing and appeal that his heart skipped a beat. "Oh, I wish you were here. Mother has been worse today. She is asking for you. Can't you come down and visit us? She wants to tell you something." I can't, he stuttered. I'm far away and I have important work to do. Tell her I will come tomorrow." Her voice was filled with disappointment and fear as she said, "Oh, I need you so. Can't you come?" "Yes, I will come as soon as I can. I will try to reach you by daylight tomorrow. My heart is with you. Call the Coopers. They will assist you. Mother wants you. She says she must see you. Come as soon as you can. I don't know what she wants to tell you, but I do know that we need you." Her meaning was as clear as if she said, "I need you because I love you. Come to me." And her request filled him with both pain and pleasure. He was a soldier and under orders from his leader, so he said, "Dear girl, there is a sick man far up on the mountainside with no one to take care of him except an elderly shepherd who is at risk of falling ill himself. I must go back to them, but trust me, I will come as soon as my responsibilities allow. Do you understand me?" Her voice grew faint as she replied, "Yes, but it feels difficult to wait." "I know. Your voice has comforted me. I was in a dark mood when I arrived here. I'm going back now to do my work, and then I will come to you. Goodbye." The transmission of that message through the wire was strangely beautiful and very subtle, as it conveyed the little sigh with which she responded to his plea. He continued his journey upward with a contemplative mood that was no longer filled with bitterness. Chapter 11. The decision that Morales made between love and duty set him apart as an officer rather than just a man, a soldier instead of a civilian. He didn't hesitate to take action, yet he experienced an internal struggle as he rode back towards the site of that brutal sacrifice driven by greed. His heart yearned for Lisa May. The sound of her captivating voice lingered in his ears, evoking the sensation of her tender lips. Even his fatigued horse felt the urgency in his unconscious urging. It will take hours before any part of the sheriff's team can reach the falls, even if they use the fastest vehicles available. And then there will be additional long hours before I can ride down to her. Yes, it will take at least a day and a night before I can hope to assist her. And the thought elicited a sigh of concern from him. During moments of mental strain like this, the journey feels endless, and the mountainous terrain seems like an unyielding obstacle. While making his way towards the hills, he encountered an elderly man who was working on an irrigation ditch by the road. The man appeared quite anxious and curious, and as he questioned the ranger, his eyes resembled those of a fearful dog anticipating his owner's reprimand. Archer pondered about this later, but at that moment his mind was preoccupied with the significance of this diligent laborer with a shovel. In this desolate land of cattle ranchers, he was a prophetic figure. "Right here, within a distance of 20 miles from this tranquil fruit grower," he remarked, "lies the ultimate disgrace of the lawless cowboy. My goodness, what a nation we are." He wondered whether the newspapers in the region would mock this act. Will this become the subject of sarcastic commentary in the press back east for a day, only to be forgotten? As his passionate emotions subsided, he lost faith in this sacrifice as well. Could anything transform the Wild West into the calmness and serenity of a domesticated ox? No, he concluded, only death can achieve that. This generation, these fierce and bloodthirsty individuals must perish. Only then can the legacy of violence be overcome and a new state be established. At the base of the arduous uphill path, he dismounted and led his tired horse. Above him, about halfway to the first summit, a blanket of soft, purplish vapor hung in the air, appearing seamless and smooth. He had to pass through it, and it symbolized the division between the plains and the mountains, between order and chaos. Once again, he ascended above it all, only to discover a breathtaking ocean illuminated by the sun, radiating hues of pink, gold, and violet. It possessed a celestial, otherworldly beauty that cast an even more ominous shadow over the smoldering altar of desire towards which he urged himself. Moment by moment, the surface undulated and shifted in rapid, tumultuous waves, silently crashing against pine-covered promontories, shimmering faintly in the distance with a serene grace. Down through a deep canyon to the south, a colossal river of mist surged, a noiseless cascade of ash-colored vapor plunging towards a silent shore. Above and beyond it, the towering peaks shone with a brilliance so pure that the lover's heart ached with the anguish of its fleeting magnificence. It was as if he gazed upon a foaming deluge, beholding the awe-inspiring and resplendent estate of an imperial ruler, whose opulent and magnificent country abode lay just beyond. Rocky spires ascended like cathedral towers, and fortresses loomed beside the current. Yet within the midst of this glorified plain, the smoke of burning arose. Slowly he guided his horse along the mountainside, eagerly grasping at every transforming aspect of this wondrous spectacle. It surpassed the enchantment of his previous moonlit encounter the night prior, for here, reality, distinct and potent, intertwined with enigma. These foothills, previously pleasingly steep, had suddenly become majestic. Everything had been magnified on a grander scale, with each rock and tree distorted by the passing translucent clouds, assuming a monstrous yet epic proportion. Ghostly white ledges emerged from the darker mist, resembling distant fields of encrusted snow. Castle-like crags emerged from the mystical river, resembling fortified islands. Cattle, silent and enormously enlarged, appeared like mythical creatures of old, gazing intently at him, their mouths moistened with dew. Bulls bellowed from the obscure depths. Lifeless trees with stark and ominous limbs ominously threatened. Everything felt as unreal as the delirium of pain, yet it possessed a beauty akin to a poet's vision. The ranger, aware that he was witnessing one of nature's rarest spectacles, removed his hat in reverence, filled with pride and contentment, knowing that this was his territory, his to protect and conserve. The pinnacle of mystery and elegance arrived as he guided his horse to a protruding point on the rocky ledge to rest. Here the cliff descended steeply into a vast abyss, and a dome of darker shadow rested upon the billowing, misty waters below. At the zenith of this shadow, a rainbow-hued halo, a complete and magnificent circle, rested, within which he beheld his own distorted and colossal reflection. "The shadows of the Brocken!" he exclaimed, overcome with ecstasy, forgetting all bitterness and worries. "Now I comprehend Goethe's words." Never before in his life amidst the mountains had he witnessed such a fusion of peak, sun, cloud, and shadow. His love for the range surged back with such intensity that tears welled in his eyes and his throat tightened. "Where else will I find such vistas?" he pondered. "Where in the lowlands could such splendors radiate? How can I abandon this lofty world where these marvels appear and vanish? I shall not. Here I shall bring my beloved and establish our abode. This is my realm." However, the mist grew somber, the fiery halo faded, the sun sank behind the hills, and the evening's chill deepened along the trail. As he approached the site of humanity's cruelty towards one another once more, the notion of camping beside those charred remains demanded heroic resolve. He also felt hunger gnawing at him, and as the air turned biting, he trembled. "At best the sheriff won't arrive before midnight," he remarked, settling in for an undesired and repugnant vigil. His only solace came from mentally composing a lengthy letter to Lisa May, whose current life brought him comfort. If purity and sweetness can arise from violence and vulgarity, then surely a new and magnificent state can emerge even from the ruins of these murdered men. Perhaps this marks the end of the old, he contemplated. Perhaps this signifies the beginning of the new. And as he pondered, the last trace of red vanished from the western sky. In the same way, hate and violence must dissipate from America, he declared, leaving behind the clear, refreshing air of liberty. In that moment he felt a connection to the poet, for he too was a lover. His loyalty to the great republic endured the trial. His belief in democracy wavered, but remained intact. "I will wait," he resolved. "This shall be the signal. If this act remains unpunished, then I will remove my badge and uniform and return to the land where such acts have been impossible for at least a century." As night descended, he built a fire to provide both illumination and protection against the cold. He felt strangely distant during this vigil. From his elevated vantage point, he surveyed the rugged plain as if it were a faintly visible yet majestic ocean. "At this very moment," he remarked, "curious and perhaps guilty eyes are speculating on the significance of my flickering firelight." His thoughts returned again and again to the tall, elderly man in the trench. What was the meaning behind his frightened and sorrowful gaze? Why would someone engaged in such peaceful activities during such a time and in such a place wear the expression of a hunted deer? What caused the tremor in his voice? Could it be possible that someone so gentle had participated in this act? Absurd suspicion, yet he had a guilty appearance. He didn't believe in ghosts, but that night he felt a stronger fear of the dark than ever before. He brought his horse close to the fire for company and made sure not to turn his back on the deceased. A peacefully lying corpse wouldn't have caused such overwhelming horror. He had witnessed battlefields, but this heap of mangled limbs even conquered the most hardened soldier. He shivered every time he remembered what he had first seen, the burnt hand, the helpless foot. From his elevated position of contemplation, he reflected on the history of the West. Originating from bloody conflicts between primitive tribes and trappers and their allies, the land had transitioned through a brief period of civilization as ranchers drove out the bison and their hunters. Vigilantes, sheriff's posses, and occasionally the regular army, had swept across these grassy hills on missions of retributive violence, ultimately dividing the territory into densely populated states. Then politics, the great national game, had turned them into a force, with senators representing a mere handful of miners and ranchers. In the United States Congress, these states had engaged in unscrupulous games, trading for local appropriations. Fortunately, in some cases, these senators had risen above their states' interests, but in other instances, they faithfully represented the violent and unprincipled cattle rancher or timber magnate. And now, as Cooper had predicted, the land speculator was about to have his term. The man who valued residence over Wild West showmen was going to govern and exploit. This promoter, almost as self-centered as the cattle baron, was going to advance the state according to his own vision of civilization. Thus, perhaps, this monstrous act, this final, inexcusable, and inhumane offense against the law and humanity, would serve as a landmark separating the old from the new. Such, at least, was the ranger's hope. Finally, deep into the night, he heard the snort of a horse and the sound of voices. The law, such as it was making its way up the mountain in the form of the sheriff of Chauvenet County, and was about to relieve the ranger from his burdensome responsibility as guardian of the deceased. At last, this law enforcement officer arrived, accompanied, like a Cheyenne chief, by a dozen lesser warriors of various conditions and kinds, but among them, second only to the sheriff, was Hugh Cooper, the forest supervisor, filled with urgency and enthusiasm. As they rode up to the fire, the officer called out, "Hey, Ranger! What's the situation?" Archer briefly and concisely explained what he had discovered. And as he spoke, other riders approached the hill and gathered closely around, listening in silent guilt. The ranger couldn't help but believe. The sheriff, himself a rancher, listened to Morales without comment until he finished with a gesture. "And there they are. I hand them over to you with great relief. I am eager to return to my own peaceful world, where such things do not occur." The sheriff took off his hat and wiped his forehead, then uttered an exclamation of awe. "Well, by God, this is unbelievable. You say there were 3 bodies. I lack the courage to identify them. I've been in battle, Mr. Sheriff, and I've seen dead men twisted in all sorts of ways, but somehow this made my knees weak. I rode away and left them. I have no desire to see them again. My part in this task is complete." Cooper spoke up. "Sheriff Van Horn, you and I have been raising cattle in this area for almost 30 years, and we've witnessed all sorts of shootings and various types of hangings. But when it comes to dismembering and incinerating men, I draw the line. I will personally offer a reward of $1,000 for the capture of these criminals, and I hope you will make it your solemn duty to track them down." "You won't have to go far," remarked Archer meaningfully. "What do you mean?" asked the sheriff. "I mean this massacre, like the others that have occurred, was carried out by ranchers who claim this territory. We are all familiar with their names." "Can it really be true?" exclaimed Cooper, looking around at the silent crowd, and in the flickering light, certain eyes seemed to shift and avoid. "How does it differ from the incident over on the Red Desert?" demanded Morales. "Who else would kill these poor shepherds but ranchers fighting over the land we stand on? But they wouldn't dare to do it themselves. No one else would. Hired killers wouldn't chop and burn. Both hatred and greed were at play in this massacre, driven mad by alcohol. I'm telling you, the men responsible for this are less than a day's ride from where we are standing." A deep silence followed, so profound that the ranger was convinced that among his listeners were those who, if they hadn't participated in the slaughter, at least knew the names of the guilty men. Finally, the sheriff spoke, this time with a sigh. "I hope you are all mistaken, Morales. I would hate to think any of my constituents had approved of this act. Give me that flashlight, Curtis." The group of ranchers dismounted and followed the sheriff to the gruesome scene, but Cooper stayed with the ranger. "Do you have any suspicions, Archer?" "No, hardly any suspicions. However, you know as well as I do that this was not a spontaneous outburst. This act was planned. It reflects the sentiments of many ranchers, except for the added horror of its execution. That was the work of drunken, enraged men. But I am more concerned about Miss Sullivan's distress. Did she reach you by phone tonight?" "No, what's the problem?" "Her mother is sick again. I called her and she asked me to come to her, but I can't because I have a case of smallpox up on the hill. Ambro, the Basque herder, has it, and another herder is up there alone with him. I need to go back to them. But in the meantime, I want you to go to the Fork and see what you can do for her." His voice, filled with emotion, touched Cooper, and he said, "Can't I go help the herder?" "No, you mustn't think of it. You have a family. But if you can find someone who has had the smallpox, send them up. The old herder who is taking care of the patient is not strong and might collapse at any moment. Then it's up to me." The men returned to the campfire, talking quietly, some of them cursing in awe. One or two of them were small farmers from Deer Creek, recent arrivals to the state, or men with groups of dairy cows, and to them, this act was incredible. The sheriff followed, saying, "Well, there's nothing to do but wait until morning. The rest of you should go home. You can't be of any help here." For over 3 hours, the sheriff and Cooper sat with the ranger waiting for daylight, and during this time, the name of every man in the area was brought up and discussed. Among others, Archer mentioned the old man in the ditch. "He wouldn't harm a fly," declared the sheriff. "He has a group of cattle, but he's the gentlest old man in the state. He's the last rancher in the area to even tolerate such work." "What prompted you to mention him?" "I encountered him on my way back," replied Morales, "and he appeared frightened." The sheriff grunted. "You must have imagined it. The old man always has a somewhat submissive appearance." Morales, exhausted, famished, and defiant, waited until the first faint light in the east signaled the dawn. Then he stood up, extended his hand towards it, and said, "A new day is upon us. Will it bring change to the state, or will it be another day of brutality?" Cooper expressed a glimmer of hope, and in that same spirit the ranger mounted his horse and rode back towards the small tent where Sullivan was attempting to make amends for his troubled past, a past that had left him aged and without companionship at 55. The sheriff and his deputies took on the task of seeking retribution, a duty bestowed upon them as law enforcement officers. It was nearly noon on a magnificent day when Morales, utterly fatigued and ravenous, arrived at the sheepherder's dwelling. Sullivan was sitting in the sun, calmly puffing on his pipe, while the sheep grazed not far away, accompanied by the dog, and an atmosphere of tranquility enveloped his sunlit rocky domain. "How is the Basque?" inquired the ranger. Sullivan pointed upwards. "Gone. So it wasn't smallpox?" "I reckon that's what it was. It was certainly severe. I believe it's an instance of Native American burial without any ceremony right here in the rocks. I'll allow you to dig the hole. I'm completely exhausted. But be sure to stay upwind at all times. I don't want you getting infected." Morales understood the importance of these precautions, but first and foremost, he needed nourishment and rest. Turning his weary horse towards the grass, he stretched out in a grassy, sunlit crevice between the rocks, and there ate and subsequently slept, while all around him the lambs called out and the rabbits made distressed sounds. He was awakened by a pebble thrown at him, and when he got up, stiff and sore, but feeling stronger and in a better mood, the sun was setting. Starting his task, he threw the loose rock out of a hollow in the ledge nearby, and to this simple grave Sullivan dragged the dead man, refusing all help, and there piled a heap of rocks on top of his grave. The ranger was deeply moved by the heartless contrast of the scene and the situation. The sun was still shining warmly across the sky. The wind, crisp and pleasant, drifted by slowly. The rabbits cried from the ledges. The lambs were calling, and amidst it all, one worn-out fragment of humanity was burying the lifeless body of another, perhaps struck by the same dreadful illness. Sullivan himself paused to contemplate. "I suppose that guy has a mother somewhere who is wondering where her boy is. This isn't exactly a Christian burial, but it's all he'll get, I guess. Because whether it was smallpox or plain fever, nobody is going to uselessly bring him back to life. Even the coyotes will avoid his flesh. Nevertheless, the ranger joined in at the end and rolled some enormous boulders onto the grave to ensure the wolves won't disturb it. "Now burn the bedding," he ordered. "The whole camp has to go, and your clothes too, after we go down the hill." "What should we do with the sheep?" "Drive them over the ridge and leave them." Sullivan did all these things, and leaving the camp in ashes behind him, Morales led the sheep in front of him on his way home. As night fell, the dog, following his command, gathered them together and put them to rest, and the men continued down the valley, leaving the loyal dog on guard, a touching symbol of faithful protection. "It pains me to abandon you, old pal," called the ranger, looking back, "but there's no other choice." "I'll come by in the morning and bring you some cookies." The collie seemed to understand. He wagged his tail and whimpered, as if struggling to express his wonder and pain. Moved with pity, Archer called out, "Come on, boy, forget about the sheep. Come with us." But the dog, leaping from side to side, let out a short howl and a sharp bark, as if to say, I can't. "He's doing his job," remarked Sullivan. "It's amazing how human they can seem sometimes. I have no doubt that guy has kicked him around many times, and yet he seems genuinely sorry about his master's trouble. Every few minutes, all night long, he'd come pattering and whining around the tent door, never coming in, just trying to ask how things were going. He was like a lonely and grieving child." It was well past dark when they entered the canyon just above the cabin, and Sullivan was shivering from the cold and weakness. "Now you park right outside the gate and wait there while I bring out some blankets. Then you'll have to strip down to nothing and start fresh," said Morales. "I'll make a fire here and we'll burn your past. What do you think?" "I'm game," responded Sullivan. "You can burn everything I own except my wife and daughter." Throughout the following ceremony, this banter continued. "I'll be a full-fledged ranger without a commission," he said with a grin, as he put on the olive-yellow shirt and a pair of dusty green pants. "And there goes my past," he added, tossing his contaminated clothes onto the fire. "What an amazing opportunity for a fresh start," commented Morales. "I hope you realize it." "I do, but it's hard to live up to your standard." Once all precautions had been taken, the ranger led the freshly cleaned, scrubbed, and transformed fugitive to his cabin. "Why, dude, you're totally qualified for the state legislature," he exclaimed as they stepped into the full light. "My clothes might not meet all your fancy requirements, but they give you a commanding presence. I wish your wife could see you now." Sullivan was dead serious as he responded, "This outfit means more to me than you can imagine. I wish I had the right to wear it. The wilderness is just about populated enough for me." "Good for you," Morales replied. "Turning a guy with your history into a conservation believer shows once again the transformative power of an idea." Then, realizing that Sullivan was genuinely sincere, he added, "You can crash with me for as long as you want. Maybe eventually you could work your way into the service as a guard, although the boss is becoming more and more insistent on real foresters." Sullivan's eyes welled up with tears as he said, "You have no idea what this clean, warm outfit means to me. For 9 years I wore prison stripes. Then I was set free with a cheap suit and an oversized hat, an ensemble that gave me away wherever I went. Until my hair and beard grew out, it was a tough hustle, but my clothes aged faster than my beard. Finally, I put all my hard-earned cash into an old, worn-out horse and a faded saddle, and once I was in the saddle, I headed north and kept moving." He smoothed the sleeve of his jacket. "It's been 10 years since I dressed like a proper man. Don't worry about food or a place to crash for now," Morales replied gently. "Food is cheap here, and rent is practically nothing, so make yourself comfortable and get back on your feet." Sullivan raised his head. "But I want to do something. I want to redeem myself in some way. I don't want my girl to know who I am, but I'd like to earn her respect. I can't be what you say she thinks I was, but if I had a chance, I might prove myself as a man again. I wouldn't mind Linda knowing that I'm alive. It might bring her comfort, but I don't want her to be informed until I can go to her in my own clothes." "She's pretty sick," said Morales. I called Lisa May last night, and if you want, you can ride down with me tomorrow and see her." The old man trembled. "I can't do that. I can't bear to tell her where I've been. She doesn't need to know. I will tell her you've been mentally unstable. I'll say whatever you want. You can go to her in the clothes you're wearing now, and she won't recognize you as the prisoner I held the other night. You can have your beard trimmed, and not even the authorities will know you." All hesitation disappeared from the convict's heart, and with a choked voice he thanked his young host. "I won't be a burden to you," he declared with more confidence. "And if my lung holds up, I'll show you that I'm not as crazy as I seem." No more mention was made of Lisa May, but Archer felt even more deeply connected to this peculiar and unhappy family. Lying in his bunk, after the lights were turned off, he imagined himself back in his family's ancestral home, answering the questions of his aunts and uncles, who were still expecting him to bring home a wealthy and beautiful American heiress. Some of the moralists were heavy drinkers, and some were promiscuous women, but overall they were quite respectable, well-behaved, and very boring. They would definitely not consider the broken ex-convict and the untidy old bartender to be the ideal match for Archer, as he was certain to marry into their family. However, as he remembered the place where he lay and the uniform hanging on the wall, he had to admit that the beautiful and wealthy heiress that his family dreamed of was nothing more than a fantasy, and honestly, he had nothing to offer in terms of such incredible good fortune. During breakfast the next morning, he said, "I have to go back and bring some food for the dog. I can't just leave him there without saying hi." "Let me do that," Sullivan suggested. "I'm afraid to go down to the fork. I think I should go back and take care of the sheep until Patrick sends someone to replace me." "That might be too late to see Linda." Lisa's voice showed great worry. "She might be on her deathbed." "No, you should come down with me today," he insisted. Eventually the old man agreed. Putting some bread in his pockets, Archer rode off up the trail to check on the dog and his flock. He hadn't gone far when he heard the jingling of bells and the sound of the lambs, and a few moments later the collie approached him with the demeanor of a boy who expects to be scolded after disobeying his master's orders. Clearly he was saying, "I brought my sheep to you because I was lonely. Please forgive me." Morales called out to him cheerfully and tossed him a piece of bread, which he caught in his teeth but didn't swallow. On the contrary, he held it while jumping for joy at the praise he heard in his new master's voice. Heading back up towards the higher peaks, the ranger instructed the collie to follow closely, and thus, fulfilling his promise, he rode back to the cabin. There he found Sullivan prepared and mounted for his important journey to the valley. Sullivan had shaved off his gray beard, and if Archer had not been aware of these changes, he would have been confused by the sight of this distinctly military figure sitting confidently on his pony by the door. "You can provide an alibi," he called out as he approached. "Patrick himself would never recognize you now." Sullivan was not in the mood for jokes. "Linda will. In the past, I used to wear a mustache, and there's a scar on my chin." As they rode, he confided this strange revelation to Morales. "I know," he said, "that Linda is old and wrinkled, for I've seen her, but I still can't fully comprehend it. That stout woman down there is not Linda. She has stolen her name and appearance. I can't exactly explain how I feel, but Lisa May now means more to me than Linda." "I think I understand," Morales sympathetically replied. The closer Sullivan came to meeting his wife, the more he trembled. Eventually he stopped in the middle of the road. "I don't think I can do it," he declared. "I'll be like a ghost to her. What's the point? My story will only worry her. I suppose it's better if I stay hidden from everyone. Let me go back. I'm utterly terrified." While he continued to argue, two men on horseback turned a sharp corner in the trail and unexpectedly encountered the ranger. Sullivan's face turned pale. "My God, it's the deputy." "Stay quiet. I'll handle the conversation," commanded Morales, who was instantly determined to protect Sullivan. "Good morning, guys," he called out cheerfully. "You're up early." The man in front was the county's deputy sheriff, and his companion was a stranger. "That was a terrible situation you stumbled upon over on Deer Creek," the deputy commented. "It definitely was. Have any arrests been made?" "Not yet, but we're following a lead. This is Marshal Haynes from Dallas, Mr. Morales," continued the deputy. The two men nodded as a sign of introduction, and the deputy continued, "You remember that old guy who used to work for Patrick?" Morales nodded again. "Well, that guy is wanted by the Texas authorities. Mr. Haynes here really wants to find him. He's an escaped convict with a bad criminal history." "Is that so?" exclaimed Morales. "I thought he seemed a bit jumpy." "The last time he was seen was when Sam Patrick sent him to tend to the sheep. I believe he was involved in that murder, along with Musina. We're going up there to try and find some trace of him. Did he show up at your station?" "Yes, he came by a few days ago on his way to replace the sick Basque, Ambro. I went up a couple of days ago and found the Basque dead and the old man gone. I buried the herder as best as I could, and I'm on my way down to report the case." The deputy pondered. "He might be lurking around some of the logging camps. I think we should go up there and investigate the area, just in case we happen to catch him." "He might have left the area altogether," suggested the ranger. "Either way, it's a long journey up there, and you'll probably have to stay at my place tonight. You'll find the key hanging over the door. Go in and make yourself at home." The deputy expressed his gratitude and was about to continue writing when Morales added, "I burned the Basque's tent and bedding to prevent the spread of disease. His belongings were worthless anyway. You will locate the sheep right above my cabin and the horse in my corral. The old man didn't take the horse, huh? Well, that settles it. He's definitely at one of the camps. Much obliged. Good day." As the two officers rode away, Sullivan leaned heavily on his saddle and stared at the ranger with wide eyes. His face was drawn and his lips dry. "They'll catch me. My God, they'll catch me," he said. "Oh, no, they won't," replied Morales. "You're all right yet. They suspected nothing. How could they with you in uniform and in my company? Nevertheless, I'm scared. That man Haynes had his eyes on me every minute. He saw right through me. They'll catch me and they'll accuse me of that killing." "No, they won't, I'm telling you," insisted the ranger. "Haynes suspected nothing. I had his attention. He never saw you before, and only has a description to rely on. So cheer up. Your uniform and your position with me will keep you perfectly safe. They'll find the Basque's camp burned and the sheep in the care of the dog, and they'll assume that you have crossed the range. But listen here, old man," and he turned to him sharply. "You didn't tell me the whole truth. You said you were out on parole." "I couldn't tell you the whole truth," replied the fugitive. "But I will now. I was serving a life sentence. I was desperate for fresh air and homesick for the mountains, and I attacked one of the guards. I was willing to do anything to escape. I thought if I could return to this country and my wife and child, I'd be safe. I said I'd be willing to return to prison if necessary, but I'm not. I can't do it. I'd die there in that hell. You must save me for the sake of my girl." His voice and eyes were filled with a kind of desperate anger and fear. Morales, feeling pity, assured him of his help. "Now listen," he said. "I'm going to protect you because of your work for that poor shepherd and for the sake of your daughter. It's my duty to catch you, of course, but I will shield you. The safest thing for you to do is to go back to my cabin. Ride slowly so that you arrive after they have left. They will most likely go to the sawmill. If they return this way, remember that the deputy only saw you as a ragged old man with a long beard, and Haynes only has a written description to rely on. There's no point in trying to escape. You are a recognizable man in that uniform, and you are safer with me than anywhere else on this side of Chicago. Haynes is likely to go across the divide thinking you went that way, and if he does, you only have the deputy to deal with." He finally succeeded in fully awakening the older man's bravery. Sullivan rose to seize his opportunity. "I will do it," he said firmly. "That's the spirit," exclaimed Morales to encourage him. "You can throw them off track this time, and when I return tomorrow, I will bring different clothes for you. Then we can plan a way to get you out of the country. I won't let them use you as a scapegoat." The ranger watched the fugitive as he started back on the trail, defying his pursuers with desperation. He had less confidence in the outcome than he had expressed. Everything depends on Sullivan himself. If he doesn't lose his nerve, if they take the uniform for granted and don't bring the matter to the supervisor, we will successfully execute the plan. And with this hope, he rode away down the trail with his head down, as all of this weighed heavily on his relationship with the girl waiting for him in the valley. He had considered Linda a burden, a social disadvantage, but now having a father who was a convict made her mother's faults seem insignificant. The closer he got to meeting Lisa May, the more important that meeting became. After all, women are more important than war. The love for home and the child persists through unbelievable hardships. The conqueror returns from foreign lands still a lover, and in the depths of flooded mines and on the icy slopes of Arctic promontories, dead men have been found clutching the picture of some beautiful girl in their rigid hands. In the face of such undeniable evidence, who can deny the endurance and reality of love? Morales had only seen May a few times, and yet she occupied his thoughts, confusing his plans, turning his mind into a place of uncertainty and hesitation. For her sake, he had embarked on a plan to protect a criminal, to shelter an escaped convict. It was futile to argue that he was motivated to protect Sullivan because of his heroic actions on the peak. He knew very well that it was because he couldn't bear to see that fair, brave girl further disgraced by the revelation of her father's identity, as his secret would inevitably come to light in the thorough investigation that would follow. To marry her, knowing the character of her parents, would be madness, and the voice inside him warned him of his foolishness. Pure water cannot be obtained from corrupt sources, it is said. Nevertheless, the thought of having the girl with him in the wilderness filled him with a divine recklessness. He was enchanted by the silky smoothness of her skin, the radiant light of her eye, the contour of her cheek, the curve of her chest, and above all, by the involuntary movement of surrender that revealed her trust and love. While he pondered, alternately flushed with determination to find happiness and chilled by a strange melancholy, he encountered Swenson, the young guard who protected the forest on the South Fork. As he approached, Morales noticed a profound seriousness in the other man's face. Swenson did not smile in greeting, as was customary, and extracting some letters from his pocket, handed them over in ominous silence. Morales, after perusing them, chose a letter evidently from Mrs. Cooper and stashed the others in his jacket pocket. It was a densely written letter, and in its opening sentence lay something that deeply affected him. Dismounting from his horse, he settled upon a stone to better read and slowly digest its contents. He read on deliberately, with no movement other than what was necessary to turn the pages. It was a fervent plea from Eleanor Cooper, urging him to sever ties with Linda Sullivan's daughter. You cannot afford to marry her. You simply cannot. The elderly mother is too dreadful and may live for many years. The girl is appealing, I admit, but she carries a stain. If heredity has any influence, she will inevitably inherit the traits of her mother or father. You must not marry her, Archer. And if you cannot, what will you do? There is only one course of action. Stay away. I have enclosed a letter from your sister, beseeching me to implore you to visit them this winter. She is not in the best health, as evident from her handwriting, and her request will provide you with an excuse to sever all ties with this girl. I am sorry for her, Archer, but you cannot marry her. You mustn't. Come over and visit us soon, and we'll discuss everything together. He opened another letter but didn't read it. He was too deeply shaken by the first. He felt the genuine friendship, the strong faith, and the protection of the writer, and he acknowledged the wisdom of everything she said. And yet, when he looked up, Swenson was staring down at him with a face of such bitterness that it broke through even the absorbed and self-centered thoughts he had been consumed by. What's wrong, Swenson? You look like you've lost a friend. I have, the guard replied curtly, and so have you. The boss is out. What? They've caught him, he exclaimed. He's out. Morales stood up. I don't believe it. For what reason? Why? Doesn't that letter tell you? The whole town is laughing. Every criminal and troublemaker in the country is disrespecting us this morning. Yes, sir. The president has fired the boss, the man who established this forestry service. Everything is falling apart, that's what it is. We'll have all the coal thieves, water power thieves, poachers, and trespassers coming at us in groups. They'll destroy the forest. I see the end of it all. They'll appoint some Western man, someone they can control. Then where will we be? Morales's young heart burned with anger, but he tried to restrain the other man's outburst. I can't believe it. There must be a mistake. Maybe they've appointed him as the secretary of the department or something. No, they haven't. They've kicked him out. They've dismissed him because he tried to prevent some theft in the coal mines in Alaska. The man was on the verge of tears, filled with frustration and righteous sorrow. His voice choked, and he turned away to hide his emotions. Morales put the letter back in his pocket and mounted his horse. Well, go back to your work, Swenson. I'm heading into town to contact the supervisor and find out what it all means, he said. He was almost as shocked as Swenson by the significance of the news. Could it really be true that the man who had built up the field service of the Bureau, the man whose honest patriotism had kept the team together, making them more united each year, like a small army of enthusiasts? Could it be possible that the creator, the organizer of this great plan, had been struck down just when his influence was most important? He refused to believe it of an administration committed to conservation. As he entered the town, he immediately noticed the change in the expressions on people's faces and the sarcastic greetings thrown his way. Hey, Mr. Cossack, what do you think of your boss now? Another person said. This will finally put an end to your nonsense, said someone else. We'll have someone in charge who understands the ways of the West and is willing to make things happen. The forest is now open for anyone to use, Patrick said, being the most offensive of them all. Wait and see, Morales replied, but he struggled to conceal the fear and anger he felt. With trembling hands, he entered the telephone booth, closed the door carefully behind him, and called the supervisor's office. When Cooper answered, he immediately asked, Is it true that the chief is no longer in charge? Cooper's voice was hoarse as he replied, Yes, my boy, they've removed him. Goodness gracious! What a devastating blow to the service! Morales exclaimed, filled with sorrow and rage. What is the president thinking to get rid of the only man who stood for the future, the man who had built up this organization, who was its inspiration? Then after a pause, he added with bitter determination, This is the end for me. This is where I step off. Don't say that, boy. We need you now more than ever. I'm finished. I'm done with America with the States. I will write my resignation immediately. Send another person to take my place. Cooper's pleas were of no use. Morales went straight from the booth to the post office, and there, surrounded by mocking and triumphant citizens, he wrote his resignation and mailed it. Then, with a stern and contemptuous expression, he left the place, ignoring the taunts of his enemies, and mounting his horse, mechanically rode away onto the plains, seeking the quiet, open spaces to regain composure and make a decision. He did not intentionally ride away from Lisa May, but as he entered the open country, he knew he was leaving her just as he was leaving the forests. He had separated himself from her as he had separated himself from the work he loved. His heart was filled with sorrow within his chest. He longed for the return of the colonel to the White House. What kind of leader is this who is willing to remove the man whose very name signifies conservation, and who in a few years would have made this group of forest rangers the most effective organization of its size in the world? He groaned again, and his throat ached with the fury of his anger. Dismissed for disobedience, the report stated. In what way? Only by fighting against greed, by stopping corruption, by preserving the heritage of the people. The most painful part was the open celebration of the very men whose persistent attempts to seize public property the chief had helped to prevent. Cooper will be next to go. The influence that caught the leader will catch Hugh. He's too good a man to escape. Then, as Swenson says, the criminals will come in to attack, destroy, and corrupt. What a country. What a country. As he reached the end of this line of hopeless thinking, he came back to the question of his remaining personal responsibilities. Sullivan must be taken care of. And then. There was May waiting for him at this moment. In his weakness, he admitted that he had never intended to marry her, and yet he had never consciously intended to harm her. He had always stopped short of the terrible betrayal involved in ruining her young love. And for her sake, To protect her from embarrassment, I will assist her father to freedom. This brought him back to the terrible tragedy of the Heights, and with that thought, the last bit of trust in the fairness of the government disappeared. They will never find those murderers. They will allow this atrocity to go unpunished like the others. It will be just another dramatic incident in the history of the area. His horse, on its own accord, turned, and by a roundabout way, finally headed towards the home canyon as if it knew its master's uncertain mind. Morales noticed what he was doing, but his relaxed hand did not interfere. Unable to make the decision himself, he welcomed the guidance of his horse's instinct to return home. With a lowered head and a brooding expression, he went back to the silence of the trail and the solitude of the hills. Chapter 12. During his solitary journey upwards and back home, the ranger pondered his emotions and realized they were filled with bitterness and disloyalty. Love had disrupted his sense of duty, and his pride had hindered and ultimately triumphed over love. His path, once straightforward and determined, now meandered aimlessly, lost in ambiguous and uncertain wanderings. Suddenly his entire world had become devoid of color, shrouded in a somber grayness. The chief forester's magnificent plan, to which he had enthusiastically pledged his allegiance, was now separate from him, a mission in which he would merely be a spectator. It had once offered something enjoyable, useful, and inspiring. Now it seemed unrealistic and pointless without the man who had devised it. "I'm approaching 40, he said. "Eleanor is right. I'm wasting my time here in these hills. But what else can I do?" He had no profession, no business, no particular expertise, except for his skills as a mountaineer. Returning to his ancestral home at this moment felt like a woeful admission of failure. However, the source of his deepest despair and uncertainty was the realization of the inherent lawlessness in his love, a power within him that now made his duties as a law enforcer sadly ironic. After all, wasn't the man who took advantage of a woman's affection and vulnerability a greater wrongdoer than someone who steals a pearl or murders for money? Betraying a soul, poisoning a young life, isn't that the unforgivable crime?